And this podcast is Black Gal, White Guy, which is a conversation on theology and social justice. Today's episode, we will be talking about nonviolence in the face of white supremacy and hatred, which is especially relevant given our national context right now. Before we get into our topic, we do want to read an email that we got from one of our listeners. So finally, people are listening and writing us. We've arrived.
Yay, all right, we're a real podcast
We
now.
are real. Um, Here is the email from Michael. Um, the email says or asks, how do we have a constructive dialogue about feminism and patriarchy without swinging pendulums in the opposite direction? In the podcast last time, you shared from your point of view that this is not your view of feminism, and I believe that's true for most. But the evidence is showing that boys may be regressing as girls continue to exceed. Two simple, systematic examples I see is that what I feel is predominantly feminist organization, public schools, is no tolerance policies for fighting and the use of the phrase "use your words." I'm concerned that as we progress under the rhetoric of a dominant gender theory, we accidentally, systematically install processes and policy that disproportionately affects boys versus girls. The fruits are starting to show this as men are increasingly more likely to commit crimes than women. Some data shows increased crime from men while crime in women has decreased. And boys are increasingly less likely to graduate high school or college, while girls are increasing in both numbers. I don't necessarily blame feminists for this, especially since I have only girls and only had sisters growing up. I just see trends that I may feel are unanticipated outcomes of increasingly swinging pendulums away from traditional patriarchy thoughts. So, Steve, what are your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? Um, okay, Michael, I really want to thank you for sending your email in. That's fantastic. We're really happy to have some interaction about this. Um, I noticed that you were saying that, so you're talking about trends, that there is a trend, a tendency uh, for boys to not graduate as much, and girls are graduating more, and that there seems to be less success for boys and more success for girls. Uh, what we need to remember is when we're talking about tendency and we're talking about increasing or decreasing, we're talking about two sexes and they're just being compared to one another. So boys are becoming less successful in comparison to girls, and girls are becoming more successful in comparison to boys. Well, if you took an unequal society and we're moving toward equality, that's what the way it would look. That you would have less success in the formerly dominant group and more success in the formerly less dominant group. And so the fact is that these kinds of statistics are what we're actually looking for to see an equal society. It may be that uh, that boys aren't doing as well, but they're going to bounce back, and it's going to be fine. And the fact is that what we want to see is we want to see success on both sides, and that will happen. It's just that there's going to be a time of balance. One thing I noticed you talking about how in public schools there are no tolerance policies for fighting, and the use of phrase "use your words." And you think that that's an indicator that it's a feminist run school. I would say that that's an indicator that violence is becoming less acceptable. Um, and I think that that's good for both sexes. That's not an indicator of a female driven society so much as this is something that, we don't really want violence in our schools. We want people to not be fighting in our schools. And uh, as far as no tolerance, I can understand what you're saying there. In other words, there's no chance to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I screwed that up." And as a kid who pulled a knife on somebody in school, I'm glad that my teachers gave me a chance to basically apologize and back off on that. And I get that, although I don't really see that as being a feminine thing or a masculine thing, or a feminine run thing or a masculine run thing. It is violence is a concern in schools for all of us, male or female. And these are just some policies, whether they're good or not. That's up to that's something for us to work out. But I don't consider that. I think it's patriarchy who says, well, this is feminine or this is masculine, rather than saying, this is an issue. How are we going to deal with this?
I agree with that. I think one of the problems that we continue to fall into as a society is that we want to label and categorize things in terms of masculine and feminine. And I just don't think that that's how God has designed this world, that these are feminine attributes, these are male attributes. Men wear these clothing, women wear this clothing. Women like to do these things, men like to do these things. I think when you begin to categorize a society like that, that's the basis of injustice, and that's the basis of discrimination against either men or female. So I totally agree with you around that. To provide a different perspective around what you were talking about, the employment in school and how men are maybe not doing as well as women, to provide a slightly different angle, I think what we're really talking about is now that women are in the labor pool, that there's competition. It's not necessarily that men are doing worse, because many statistics will show you that women are still statistically paid less than men, that women continue to suffer as a result of being mothers, that they end up making less, they don't get as many promotions, they don't end up being the top CEOs and executives in their organizations and in their job places. So I think that there's still a gender bind when we talk about success. Even without that bind, what we're talking about is that now that there are laws that protect and say that women need to be treated fairly, they're being treated fairly. It's not that that these laws are discriminating against men. It's saying that instead of oppressing women, we're going to allow women's authority and autonomy to be such that of men. And that's a beautiful thing, because both men and women are created in the image of God. Both men and women are endowed with inalienable rights and gifts and just wisdom from our Creator. And so we should be treated as equals and not as men are better than or women are better than, because we're both God's children. We're both made in His image. And so to say that there's no place for that competition, to say that there's no place for both men and women to thrive in education, in employment, and in any other sector in society, first of all, I think sets up a false dichotomy about who we are as created beings. And again, just re-emphasizes, well, not re-emphasizes, but it makes discrimination all the more apparent. I think some of the same arguments are made around affirmative action, quite frankly, when it talks about more people of color being hired, more people of color going to school, more people of color being able to compete. Previously, we weren't able to, but because of civil rights legislation, because of other laws, now we're able to do some of the things that we weren't able to do under the Jim Crow South and under segregation. Whites are still doing statistically better than people of color. And, and so that's the reality. But in instances where people of color seem to be gaining ground, it's because finally we have an opportunity to be in the labor force. Finally, we have an opportunity to be taken seriously in terms of education. Finally, and a lot of it needs to be argued that we still have a long way to go. We do. But now we can't just say, well, white people are thriving and don't have to worry about competition from people of color, because that's not true any longer. And the same thing goes with women. So
So you want to know what I'm really concerned about, Ebony? I've noticed or I've seen the statistics. There's definitely a trend that fewer and fewer white men are in podcasts. These black women are coming up and taking over all the white men in podcasts. Pretty soon, there won't be any white men doing podcasting at all anymore. I'm really worried about
I don't know what to tell you. Because we're so fly and so amazing. And podcasts are equally accessible to all of us. So go and get yours.
Dang, I think we need some affirmative action for white men doing podcasts.
So, do you have any recommendations this week?
I do. So this is what I've discovered, that I don't really have a lot of bias or prejudice against people because of color or race or religion. But it seems like I do have one really serious bias, which is Facebook. If a person is not on Facebook, they're not actually real to me. So in the last couple weeks, Ebony, I've noticed that you and I have become friends on Facebook, and I'm seeing a lot more of your stuff. So I see you as a real person now. Now you're actually a real person. You posted something, and so my recommendation this week is not a movie or a podcast. Yeah, it's not going to be a podcast. My recommendation this week is a meme. And the meme is this: it's called Racism Scale, Where Do You Fall? It summarizes a whole bunch of racist statements, or whether mild or heavy, positions, whether minor, and it puts them on a scale. Now, I don't necessarily agree that the scale is precise, but it basically gives an idea of, hey, you see all of these statements, all of them are racist on some level or another. And what I see it as a tool is, rather than say, well, I'm here or I'm there, uh, I see it as a tool for folks, especially folks who are white, to look at it and say, oh, I didn't think that was racist. Well, what's racist about that? What could possibly be racist about that? And I think it's a good thing for us to look at, to consider, to think about another point of view, and possibly even to take some of these statements and ask our friends who are people of color and say, do you consider this racist? What makes this racist? I think it's a really good tool, and it's all compact into one nice little thing. So once again, it's called Racism Scale, Where Do You Fall?
Absolutely. I can't remember who wrote it or who designed it.
I looked it up. I looked it up, and it just turned out to be, it's just this organization that put it out there. So it was in an article that you posted.
By Medium, yeah.
Um, and right, and that was the art. It's April Harder, Harter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but I don't think the meme is hers. I think the
Yeah.
meme is somebody else's. So
I didn't gather that it was hers either. Yeah, I agree. That's a really great resource, and something that people should look into. I think also one of the resources that I ended up posting this week on Facebook is a syllabus for white people to educate themselves. Actually, a friend of mine, Christena Cleveland, I think she started compiling this after the election and found that it had staying power. So after the acts in Charlottesville, Virginia last week, she continued to add to it. And so I know that there's a ton of things there. I think one of the really important things that's really valuable about this tool is that she doesn't say woke white people, a syllabus for people who don't know anything about racism. She says specifically white people to educate themselves. And I think one of the things we have to be conscious of in this society is that no matter how woke any individual, but especially white, are, that we still have a lot to learn around how we show up for racial justice. And so there's growth that needs to happen among all white people because we live in a racist society. And that's true not just for white people, but it's true for people of color as well, because white supremacy is so pervasive that we end up, even when we have the best of intentions, having a bias, having a prejudice, having some other sort of thing that ends up oppressing people that sometimes we care about, sometimes we don't care about. But we all have a lot of unlearning to do. And so my recommendation is this syllabus to help us continue to have the conversation and continue to develop language, technique, skill, knowledge around how we really get to the bottom of white supremacy and racism in our society.
But Ebony, you don't need that. You're already perfect and you already know everything.
Nope. And so the reason I mentioned people of color also needing to do that work is because, like I said, we live in a society where white supremacy and racism is so pervasive. It's in the air we breathe. It's in the stores we go to. It's in the schools where we send our children. It's in the air. It's in the water. Like, it's literally in Flint's water. Like, that's just a prime example. It's in the water in North Dakota, like the pipeline. Like, it's literally physically everywhere. And so how can someone grow up in a society and not be scathed by that, even when you're doing your work? So we all have to be intentional about how we get rid of white supremacy. There has to be a practice around how we end up showing up for racial justice. So one of the things I wanted to tell you is that I ended up watching the recommendation that you gave us last time, Accidental Courtesy.
Oh, awesome. Well, how did you like it?
I have to tell you, I struggled watching that documentary for many reasons. For one, um, it's hard to see and hear so much hatred against Black people. Like, that's hard,
Oh, yeah.
just hard. Period. I wrestle with two things. I really appreciate Daryl Davis and what he's trying to do in terms of friending people who are white supremacists and Nazis. I think a lot of people would have hard time doing that, and so I mean, mad props to him for that's. I just want to call that out. Like, that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. Where I struggle is his approach. I struggle with the fact that it seemed to me through watching the documentary that he had an easier time building and maintaining friendships and relationships with white supremacists than the people that he claimed to be fighting on behalf of. And so I had a hard time watching him dishonor the Black Lives Matter activists like that. Um, I felt like the language got really heated. I expected more. And so when I saw one of the elders in the African American community really chastising him, I was like, that's really good. Like, he called him out. He didn't let him get away with the language that he was using towards those young Black men who are putting themselves on the line to fight against police brutality. And that's not to say that his work wasn't valid. Like, Daryl Davis's work can stand and the Black Lives Matter work can stand, but he didn't have to diss them and disrespect them in the way that he did.
I think what happened in that particular scene, and by the way, even if you haven't seen Accidental Courtesy, you can go to YouTube, and that particular scene of Daryl Davis talking to Black Lives Matter, it's on there. It's on YouTube. But I think that what happened was it was this imbalance where at first he felt disrespected, and then he was giving disrespect, and it just ended up into a cluster mess. It was awful. It was a very difficult scene to watch, but I think you're right. Given how he interacts with so many other people, and he's really he's got a lot of skill in being able to do that. He really screwed up that conversation.
I think so. It's like, to me, it was like you show a lot of grace and mercy towards white supremacists. Why aren't you extending that same grace and mercy towards the people who you say you're actually fighting on behalf of. And so to me, it was a disconnect. And I began to question whether or not this was some type of personal vendetta or if he really was committed to undoing the effects of white supremacy on the way that it has affected the Black body. And so I had to write about it. I spent a lot of time writing about it and then writing an article that is nearly done now, because it was so heavy.
Where is that article found? Where's your blog post on that?
I haven't finished it yet.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, when you do finish it, will you post the link
Yes.
on Meta Nerds? Are you going to post it on Meta Nerds, you think?
I don't know. I didn't know if I was gonna post it on my blog because it's a really long article. It's 7 pages. That means nobody's gonna read it.
Oh, but now we've advertised it on the podcast.
Yes, this is true. So, I'll see. I'm also writing a book right now, and so it could find its way in the book, which is kind of what I'm leaning towards. But maybe I'll shorten it for the sake of this conversation and put a shortened version on my blog so people can see what I'm really wrestling with in terms of documentary. And I had some other issues too. I think because of the way because I do come from a community organizing background, a coalition building background, I don't really see him doing that. And so, in terms of like sustainability and who are the people that he's training and leading to do this work when he's done, I don't see that happening. And so like that was there were various tensions, not just because of what he did to the Black Lives Matter activists, but I have a question concerning sustainability and method as well. Anyway, that's gonna take us, like, if we continue to talk about this, we could spend the whole rest of the podcast because I have so many thoughts. But we're here to get into this conversation about nonviolence in the face of white supremacy and hatred. And so you are an Anabaptist. I am not. I'm Pentecostal, Presbyterian, Baptist, something. Like, I love Jesus. But you're an Anabaptist. The Anabaptist tradition has a rich theology and practice around nonviolence. And so I wanted us to be able to have a conversation about what that looks like in the face of Charlottesville and just really explicit acts of hatred towards not only Blacks, but Jews and other people of color as well. And so, my first question for you is, as Christians who are committed to peace and racial justice, how do you think we best show up in times of such visible racism and hatred demonstrated by white supremacist groups, including neo Nazis and the KKK?
Um, I feel like the typical church reaction to that, or even Mennonite Church USA this week or last week put out a put out a statement just saying, "Hey, we are absolutely opposed to white supremacy. We're absolutely opposed to racism, and we have a call to action and all of that." I believe that most churches will make statements against white supremacy behind the pulpit, and will make very firm belief statements. They'll write liturgies. They'll have discussions in their churches, and that's usually where it stops. And I do not believe that that is an adequate response to for an adequate response from churches, from Anabaptists or anybody else. MCUSA, Mennonite Church USA, posted, "Well, we need to have a call to action." What action? What are you calling us to do? What do you think I mean, and I'll tell you, what I think that we ought to do is we need to be standing out there. We need to be at the protests. We need to be vulnerable. Most of us keep going to church and want to talk these things out in church. Number one, because we think that faith is most important, and yet faith without works is dead. But secondly, we're safer there. We're not vulnerable. But once we take a step out, if we took the things that we say, if we're against racism, if we are against white supremacy, then we need to take that out on the street corner, and not just keep it in the church. We need we need to be public about that, and we could make some statements like that on social media, but even that isn't vulnerable enough. Honestly, it's easy to make statements on social media and leave it, and then just walk away from it. But I think that what we need to be doing is we need to have two things. Number one, we need to be having conversations. We need to be having conversations with family members who maybe disagree with us. We need to be having conversations with friends. I've had amazing conversations with friends, almost most of which are on, not exclusively, most of which are on social media. But those conversations are good to have on social media because people will tend not to, you know, if anybody does all caps, we just say, "Would you stop yelling?" Usually, it gets, but usually you don't get to the yelling part so much on social media. Anyway, we need to be having conversations, and we need to be taking part in protests, especially protests that are led by people of color. We need to go to organizers who are people of color and say, "How can I help?" Rather than saying, we're going to go out, we're going to do this ourselves. We're going to speak out. That doesn't mean that there aren't some great white-led groups that are against white supremacy. There's some really good groups that way, but I think that the real effectiveness is when they're giving leadership to people of color.
So I opened and said that I'm not a Mennonite at all, by any stretch of the imagination.
You're scaring me, Ebony.
Sorry.
Are you going to slap me? Is that where you're leading to? You say, Steve, I've been wanting to slap you this whole time. I'm just telling you that.
No, I'm not a Mennonite, but I identify with a lot of the theology, so I fit. But I, like I said, I know that pacifism and nonviolence is a core value in the denominational tradition. Do you think that there is ever a place to break away from this core value of nonviolence? Or rather, have you seen instances in your theology or even biblically where exceptions are made?
Um, I think the problem is that in different groups of Mennonites, you're going to have nonviolence or non-resistance defined differently. And I find that for the most part, in Mennonite practice, in Mennonite history, at least from the 1600s on, what we find is that Mennonites tend to be more passive than pacifist. Um, we want to uh, we we want to avoid conflict. I will say I've been I don't know how many different Mennonite groups, and it's very easy for people to just sidestep conflict rather than actually deal with disagreement or deal with issues. That is not uh, Jesus' form of non-resistance. And I believe that Mennonites, a lot of them do. And if I've got Mennonite friends who are watching this and they're saying, "Well, Steve, you don't have any problem with conflict. We know you jump in there with both feet." I apologize. I'm sorry. Um, but the thing is that it's. I believe that when Jesus went and he talked about non-resistance, his form of non-resistance is not a passive form. He put himself in the place of danger and allowed people to slap him, to kick him, to insult him. He put himself out there in the place of vulnerability, where he was vulnerable and he was exposed, completely exposed to death. And that is real non-resistance. That is real. And so a lot of times we're going to see that we need to be there for other people, and non-resistance means, or non-violence means, we're going to take the violence on ourselves instead of having somebody else experience it. And that's what Jesus did for us. That's the example. that we have. It's not being passive. It's not remaining, it's not trying to avoid vulnerability. It's being completely vulnerable for the sake of the vulnerable. We are accepted. We who have privilege, we who have power, take on vulnerability, step out there. That way, others who are more vulnerable than we are can be protected.
That's really, really powerful. I never really thought about it like that.
Ebony, let me ask you a question. Okay, so you've been exposed, you've been vulnerable, you've been hurt. Are you? How do you feel about nonviolence or a position of nonviolence? How does that? How does that affect you? Do you? Uh, what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So, one, I am conflict averse to the core. Like, hi, I'm Ebony. I'm conflict averse, like avoidant to like it, and I think some of it has to do with my background, my family of origin, but like in terms of like how I'm wired as well, I just don't want to have to. I don't want to be confrontational. I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable in terms of me confronting something that could be challenging or difficult for them. So it's something that I have worked on over the last few years and paid a lot of intentional, um, just focus around being direct, being assertive, because I am so conflict averse by nature. And so for me, when you talk about nonviolence, by nature, I am a nonviolent person, because it does not mesh with my core values. It does not mesh with my personality style to the extent I can't watch violent movies at all. Like if people are being hurt, I cannot watch it. If I see a movie, I watch, what movie was this? Oh, Beast of No Nation last year with Idris Elba and some, I can't remember the other cast in the movie, but I couldn't watch it because they were brutalizing the women and children. I'm like, I can't watch this anymore. I have to go away. Um, just because I have such a low tolerance towards um, nonviolence and just hurt and pain. Like I really just can't stomach it. And that being said, I know that that's how I am, that that's how I'm wired. When we talk about nonviolence in the face as an approach, as a praxis around resisting racial justice, I appreciate and resonate with what you said, because I think so often the onus is laid on people of color to be nonviolent, to be to model things as Dr. King did, to just take the beating, to take the discrimination, just take it because that's holy and that's honorable. And for a while, I really resonated with that because of my own just demeanor. But at the same time, as I've grown in my walk with Christ and I've grown in my knowledge around racial justice and the multitude of strategies that really exist, I begin to wrestle and really question with that line of thinking. One thing that I think really illustrates what I'm trying to say quite clearly is this documentary that Angela Davis did, or not that she did, but that she participated in 1972 when she was in prison. And there's this quote that has resonated with me since I heard it. That not necessarily that I try to live my life by now, but it's something that when I think about this quote, I have a much more nuanced approach towards nonviolence. And here's the quote. It says, if you are a Black person who lives in the Black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me whether I approve of violence, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Reflecting on Davis's quote, when we talk about nonviolence and we talk about people of color and Black people needing to be nonviolent in spite of what they have faced, It doesn't make sense any longer. Um, do I want people to be violent? No. Do I wish that there was a better outcome for all of us? Yes. You talked about, as we were answering the email about the school stuff, like, I don't want violence to exist for any of us. And I realize that we live in a system where police are violent toward black people, teachers are violent toward black people, policy and practices are violent toward black people, white supremacists are violent towards black people. To ask me to not be violent does not make sense.
But see, this is the thing, is that when Jesus said, there's that statement that a lot of people bring up, is that Jesus said, I did not come to bring peace but a sword, right? Okay. What Jesus meant by that, if you look at it, is that he said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword, meaning I came to bring conflict. There is going to be conflict. Once again, if we have an unequal society, there is going to be structures torn down, and there is going to be conflict. That's going to happen. If we want a society of love, there's going to be conflict. But what Jesus is saying is, I am bringing the conflict, but I'm not going to be bringing the violence. The other side will be bringing the violence. I'm not going to bring it. They're going to bring it, and I'm going to take it. Now, I believe that as white protesters or anything like that, that we should be standing up. We should be standing up with the privilege uh, and taking the violence for those who have been taking it. And sometimes that means that even on social media, if I have a friend, I had a friend one time, and she's always dealing with people who are saying racist things and having to talk with them. And at one point, I just stepped in and I started talking. I started responding to that person, and that gave her the freedom to step back. And she said to me later, "Thank you so much for doing that. I've been doing this for years, and I just need a break." And I said, "Look, anytime you want some help like that, I'm there
Right,
for
right.
you. I'm always ready to yell at people. I mean, have discussions with people." So, are we gonna? Did you have one other question, or?
I did, but I think actually you answered it. So, in terms of the role for anarchists in this movement, and to not quote Trump, because whoever wants to quote Trump, like, whatever. Um, so maybe we won't go there because I don't want to center him in my discussion.
Thank you.
Um,
Really. I, every time I hear that man's name, I just go, really? Can I just shut this down right now?
Right, 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 right. Um, yeah, I think because what I wanted to ask was, well, I'll say it anyway, without saying the D word, the DT word. Um, I watched a clip about Dr. Cornel West of the counter protest last week and heard him talk about how the anarchists helped keep the attacks against people who were fighting against the marching white supremacists at bay. So that there was not even more chaos. I don't know where the clip is. My husband showed it to me last night, and he just passionately just went in about how if it was not for these anarchists, that things could have got really heated. Um, and while I don't want to validate or defend his claim, mostly because I was not there, I wanted to ask about whether or not his line of defense is appropriate within Mennonite ways of thought. So, not just in terms of taking the violence, but I think in some instances you saw these anarchists who were actually fighting and exerting themselves physically in order to keep the violence against the violence from the white supremacists at bay. So is there room for that um, in the way that Mennonites believe and practice?
Well, I think, in fact, actually, there was about a month ago that my daughter and I went to a anti-fascism protest, and Antifa was there, and or what they call the Black Bloc. They were there, and they were all standing in a line, and they had all their arms linked as that. And I went in front of them, I went behind them, and all of that. And then there was another group, and they were doing a little training before the protest actually happened about peacemaking and trying to create peace in this kind of a situation. And I think that we need, in a protest, a lot of approaches need to be used. A lot of approaches need to be taken because we need to be able to protect the people that need to be protected. We need to have people who are out there giving the information, telling people to have a number, a phone number write it on your arm, so that way if you get arrested and taken to jail, that you can have support. What to do if there's tear gas. We needed that kind of information out there. It was great. It was so many different approaches and so many different people. And the fact is that there is room for active pacifists in that kind of a situation. And we should not be speaking against the Black Bloc because they have a different approach than we do. We should not be talking against these people. Rather, we need to recognize that these folks are our allies, even if they take a different approach. And hopefully, and I'll tell you, I've worked with a lot of these folks, people who said, well, I'm going to be violent. And I said, well, I'm not going to be violent, but I'll die for you. How's that? And we're friends, we're comrades, we are partners in, even if we take different approaches, in order to accomplish the same task, which is to provide equality and power in our society.
I'm learning so much from this conversation because what I'm hearing from you is that the thoughts and the approach around nonviolence is way more nuanced than the way that I have always thought about it. As I've said, my basis of understanding around nonviolence comes from really the way that Dr. King lived and practiced. But even he himself said that a riot is the language of the unheard. And so there seemed to even be some nuance with the way he did things as well. So all that to say is I'm learning a lot and feel like I have a much better understanding of how Mennonite theology around nonviolence really interfaces with not just racial justice, but life in general. So those are all of my questions. Steve, do you have any last tidbits for me before we close out?
Well, I don't. I will say that protests are fun, and more Mennonites need to be involved in it. That's the only thing.
Amen to that. So on that note, thanks so much for joining our discussion today. Our next topic, which has not yet been decided, will be in 2 weeks. If you'd like to contact us, and please do, we like emails, you can email us at bgwg@minnonerds.com. Again, that email address is bgwg@minnonerds.com. If your email is cool, and even if it's not, as long as you email us and it's not slanderous, we will read it and comment on it on our next episode.
And if you cuss, Ebony promises to.
Yes. I did say that before. We want to thank Ryan Robinson for his amazing editing skills. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and give you peace. Amen.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at mennonerds.com. It's the hub for all things Menno Nerds. From there you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out menonerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.